In a small coastal town, single mother Elena Alvarez is accused of stealing a priceless pearl necklace from her wealthy employer, forcing her and her young son into poverty and disgrace. But the truth behind the theft reveals a hidden act of sacrifice. Elena secretly hid the necklace to protect her employer's daughter, Isobel, from an abusive arranged marriage. As Elena battles betrayal, injustice, and the weight of her secret, the stakes grow higher with every passing moment. The storm rolled in with an unseasonable ferocity, sweeping through the narrow streets of the small coastal town of Clearwater. Rain pelted the cobblestones like impatient fingers tapping on a locked door, as if urging the sleepy town to wake up and witness the drama about to unfold. Amid the downpour, Elena Alvarez trudged up the muddy incline toward her tiny weather-beaten cottage on the hill, her 9-year-old son Leo trailing behind her. His boots squelched in the muck, his small hands clutching a worn canvas satchel filled with schoolbooks. "Elena!" A sharp voice sliced through the sound of the rain. Elena froze, her fingers tightening around the frayed handle of the wicker basket she carried. Turning slowly, she met the piercing gaze of Mrs. Moreland, the housekeeper of Windermere Manor, the grand estate where Elena had worked for nearly a decade. "You're to report to the manor at once," Mrs. Moreland commanded, her lips a thin, disapproving line. "Mr. Hargrove wishes to speak with you." "Now." Elena nodded without a word, her heart sinking. She had seen this coming, ever since the pearl necklace had gone missing from the velvet-lined case in Mrs. Hargrove's bedroom. Whispers of suspicion had followed her for days, but she couldn't defend herself, not without revealing the truth. And the truth was far more dangerous. Leo tugged at her sleeve. "Mama, are you in trouble?" His voice was barely audible above the rain, but his wide, questioning eyes cut through Elena's heart like a blade. "No, mijo," she lied, brushing a damp curl from his forehead. "Go inside and finish your homework. I won't be long." She watched him disappear into the cottage before turning back toward the manor, dread pooling in her stomach like the rainwater in the gutters. As she walked, memories flooded her mind. Memories of Isobel, the Hargroves' 16-year-old daughter, sobbing in her arms just a week ago. "He'll ruin my life," Isobel had whispered, her voice trembling with fear. She had clutched the pearl necklace in her hand, her knuckles white. "I'll sell it and run. It's the only way." Elena had acted on instinct, hiding the necklace in a place she knew no one would find it. She hadn't thought about the consequences, only about protecting the girl who had no one else to turn to. Windermere Manor loomed ahead, its spires disappearing into the misty twilight. The Hargrove family had ruled Clearwater for generations, their wealth and influence casting a long shadow over the town. Elena hesitated at the grand oak doors, her trembling fingers brushing the brass knocker. When she was ushered into the sitting room, she found herself surrounded by accusing eyes. Mr. Hargrove stood by the fireplace, his imposing frame silhouetted against the flickering flame. Mrs. Hargrove perched on the edge of an armchair, her perfectly manicured hands clasped tightly in her lap. And Isobel sat silently by the window, her face pale and expressionless. "Elena," Mr. Hargrove began, his tone icy. "The necklace." "Where is it?" "I don't know," Elena replied evenly, though her pulse thundered in her ears. Mrs. Hargrove let out a sharp, incredulous laugh. "Don't insult our intelligence. You're the only one who had access to my room." "I didn't take it," Elena said quietly, her voice steady despite the storm of emotions raging inside her. "Then perhaps the constable can help jog your memory," Mr. Hargrove snapped, his eyes narrowing. "If that necklace isn't returned by morning, I'll have no choice but to press charges." Elena glanced at Isobel, hoping for some sign of support, but the girl refused to meet her gaze. The silence stretched, heavy and oppressive, until Mrs. Moreland appeared in the doorway. "Will that be all, Mr. Hargrove?" she asked, her tone clipped. "Yes, escort her out." Elena walked home in the pouring rain, her mind racing. She knew she couldn't retrieve the necklace without exposing Isobel's plan, but how could she protect her own future and Leo's while carrying the weight of this secret? When she reached the cottage, she found Leo waiting for her on the porch, his face lit by the soft glow of the lantern. He ran to her, his arms wrapping tightly around her waist. For a moment, the warmth of his embrace was enough to silence the doubts gnawing at her soul. He whispered, looking up at her with a determination that belied his years. "I'll help you. Whatever it is, we'll figure it out." Elena knelt down, brushing the damp strands of hair from his forehead. "You're a good boy, Leo," she said softly, her voice thick with emotion. "But some battles a mother must fight alone." She didn't tell him that this wasn't just her fight, it was theirs. Together, they were up against a world that saw them as nothing more than the help, disposable, unworthy, invisible. But she would face it all for him, just as she had faced every hardship since the day he was born. The storm outside raged on, but inside their small, battered home, a quiet resolve began to take root. Elena would protect Leo at all costs, even if it meant sacrificing her reputation, her livelihood, and the fragile threads of security they had managed to weave. Because love, she had learned, was not just a feeling, it was an unbreakable promise. The next morning, Clearwater stirred to the first light of dawn, the storm's remnants clinging stubbornly to the air. Elena awoke to the muffled sound of voices outside her cottage. Peering through the thin curtains, she saw a group of townsfolk gathered near the gate. Their faces, etched with suspicion and judgment, turned away quickly when her eyes met theirs. "Elena!" Mrs. Moreno, the baker's wife, called out, her voice laced with a mix of pity and scorn. "They're saying terrible things about you in the square. Best you stay home today." Elena's heart clenched, but she refused to let her face betray the turmoil within. She nodded curtly, closing the curtains. She wouldn't cower. Not today, not ever. In the kitchen, Leo sat at the table nibbling on a piece of bread too stale to be satisfying. He looked up as Elena entered, his dark eyes searching hers. "Mama, why are they mad at you?" Elena hesitated, her chest tightening. "Sometimes people believe what they want to believe no matter what's true," she said, keeping her tone light. "You just focus on school, mijo. That's what matters." "But school isn't fair if people are mean to you," Leo insisted, his small fists clenched. "I can tell them the truth." Elena crouched beside him, taking his hands in hers. "No," she said firmly. "You don't owe anyone the truth. Not yet. Sometimes, silence is the only thing that can protect someone you love." Leo frowned, clearly dissatisfied with her answer, but he nodded. He didn't understand fully, but he trusted her. That trust was both her greatest strength and her heaviest burden. The day unfolded slowly, with whispers of the missing necklace weaving their way through every corner of Clearwater. At the fish market, at the baker's, even at the church where Elena usually found solace, everywhere, her name was on their tongues. Elena avoided the town entirely, spending the morning scrubbing the floor of their cottage until her fingers ached, trying to will away the gnawing sense of helplessness. By midday, there was a sharp knock at the door. When Elena opened it, Isobel stood on the threshold, her face pale and drawn. She wore a simple wool cloak, the hood pulled low as if to hide from prying eyes. "I need to speak with you," Isobel whispered, glancing over her shoulder. Elena stepped aside, closing the door quickly. "What are you doing here? If someone sees you—" "I can't stay long," Isobel interrupted, her voice trembling. "Father sent men to search your house. They're coming this afternoon." Elena's stomach dropped. "They'll find nothing," she said, though her voice faltered. "But if they do?" Isobel pressed, her tone desperate. "Elena, I never meant for it to go this far. I thought I could fix it. I was going to sell the necklace and use the money to leave, but you didn't," Elena finished, her voice laced with quiet anger. "You left me to carry the blame instead." Tears welled in Isobel's eyes. "I was scared. You don't understand. My parents would force me to marry him. He's twice my age and cruel. I couldn't stay here." Elena sighed deeply, torn between fury and pity. "I understand more than you think," she said at last. "But now you've put my son and me in the middle of your fight, and we can't afford to lose. I'll fix it," Isobel promised, though the words sounded hollow. "I'll find a way." "You'd better," Elena said sharply, her gaze unwavering. "Because if they find that necklace, I won't have a choice but to tell them everything." Isobel nodded, her hands trembling as she pulled her hood back up. "Thank you," she whispered, before slipping out into the gray afternoon. Elena barely had time to process the encounter before the search party arrived. Led by Mr. Hargrove's steward, a surly man named Peter, they entered the cottage without preamble, their eyes scanning the modest furnishings with thinly veiled disdain. "This won't take long," Peter announced, though the way his men began pulling open drawers and overturning cushions suggested otherwise. Leo hovered near the doorway, his small frame rigid with anxiety. "You can't just take our things," he blurted, his voice cracking. "Leo, hush," Elena said softly, placing a hand on his shoulder. Peter smirked. "Teaching him young to defend thieves, I see." Elena's cheeks burned, but she remained silent, her grip tightening on Leo's shoulder. She could feel the boy trembling beneath her hand, and it took every ounce of restraint not to lash out. The search dragged on, each minute stretching into an eternity. Elena's heart raced as they approached the small cupboard where she had hidden the necklace, tucked away in the false bottom of an old sewing box. Her mind spun with excuses, contingencies, anything that might save her from the inevitable. But then, as if by some miracle, they stopped. Peter motioned for his men to leave, his expression one of grudging disappointment. "Nothing here," he muttered. "For now." Elena exhaled slowly, her knees threatening to buckle as the men filed out. When the door closed behind them, she turned to Leo, who looked up at her with wide, questioning eyes. "They didn't find anything," he said, his voice filled with cautious relief. "But what if they come back?" "They won't," Elena said, though she wasn't sure she believed it herself. That night, as Leo slept fitfully beside her, Elena stared at the ceiling, her mind racing. She had bought herself a little more time, but the storm was far from over. Isobel's secret was a ticking clock, and every moment that passed brought them closer to ruin. The next day, Elena made a decision. She couldn't wait for Isobel to find her courage. If she was going to protect Leo and preserve what little dignity they had left, she would have to take matters into her own hands. She didn't yet know how she would fix the mess, but she knew one thing for certain: she couldn't do it alone. The morning sun struggled to pierce through the overcast sky as Elena left Leo with Mrs. Moreno, who, despite her sharp tongue, had agreed to watch him for the day. Elena made her way toward the town square, her steps measured but resolute. Every glance cast in her direction felt like an accusation, every whispered conversation like a knife slicing through her composure. She kept her gaze forward, forcing herself to appear unbothered. If she crumbled now, she'd never find the strength to do what needed to be done. Her destination wasn't Windermere Manor, or even the constable's office, but the modest apothecary on the edge of town. Inside, the smell of dried herbs and medicinal tinctures hung heavy in the air. Behind the counter stood Mr. Cardenas, an elderly man with a thin frame and keen eyes that always seemed to know more than he let on. "Elena," he greeted, his tone both kind and curious. "It's been some time. I need your help," Elena said, wasting no time. "It's about Isobel Hargrove." Mr. Cardenas raised an eyebrow but said nothing, waiting for her to continue. "You've known the Hargrove family longer than anyone," Elena pressed, her voice low. "You must know the kind of man Mr. Hargrove is, the kind of things he's capable of. Isobel's in danger, but she's too scared to speak up. I can't prove it without her confession, but if there's anything you know, anything that could convince him to back off..." Mr. Cardenas sighed, rubbing a hand over his weathered face. "I don't meddle in their affairs," he said carefully. "The Hargroves have power, and people like us don't stand a chance against them." "Please," Elena insisted, her voice cracking. "If I don't find a way to protect her, my son and I will pay the price." The mention of Leo seemed to strike a chord. Mr. Cardenas's expression softened, and he leaned closer. "There's something," he admitted reluctantly. "Years ago, before Mrs. Hargrove, there was another woman, one Mr. Hargrove was engaged to. She disappeared under strange circumstances. There were rumors, but nothing ever proven." Elena's stomach churned. "Do you think "I think Mr. Hargrove values control above all else," Mr. Cardenas said gravely. "And when he loses it, people suffer." The weight of his words settled heavily on Elena's shoulders, but they also ignited a flicker of determination. If Isobel was to escape her father's control, Elena would have to be smart, smarter than a man who had built his life on silencing opposition. "Thank you," she said quietly, her mind already racing with possibility. Back at the cottage that afternoon, Elena found Leo playing with Mrs. Moreno's grandchildren in the yard. She watched him from the window, her heart aching at the sight of his carefree laughter. He didn't yet understand the magnitude of their situation, and she was grateful for that small mercy. Isobel arrived just as the sun dipped below the horizon, her face drawn and her hands trembling. "I've thought of something," she said breathlessly as Elena ushered her inside. "I'll leave tonight, go to the city and find work. If I'm gone, Father won't have any reason to press charges against you." "And how do you plan to get there?" Elena asked, crossing her arms. "Do you have money? A plan?" "I'll manage," Isobel said, though her voice wavered. "I can't stay here, Elena. I can't face him." "You don't have to face him alone," Elena said firmly. "But running away without a plan will only make things worse." "Then what do you suggest?" Isobel snapped, her frustration bubbling to the surface. "If I stay, he'll marry me off to that man, and if I leave, he'll punish you instead." Elena took a deep breath, weighing her options. She had never been one to act impulsively, but desperate times called for desperate measures. "There's something I need to show you," she said finally. "Come with me." Under the cover of darkness, Elena led Isobel to the secluded spot where she had hidden the necklace. It was buried beneath a loose floorboard in the abandoned chapel at the edge of town, a place few people ever ventured. The wooden floor creaked beneath their feet as Elena knelt and pried the board loose, revealing the velvet pouch. Isobel stared at the pouch, her expression a mixture of relief and guilt. You really kept it safe." "I didn't do it for you," Elena said, her voice sharper than she intended. "I did it because I couldn't let you throw your life away. But now it's your turn to make a choice. If you want to leave, I'll help you. But you'll have to use this," she held up the necklace, "to buy your freedom." Isobel hesitated, her hands trembling as she reached for the pouch. "What about you? If they find out you helped me, that's my risk to take," Elena said. "But I won't help you unless you promise me one thing." "What?" Isobel asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "That you'll tell the truth when you're safe," Elena said. "About the necklace, about your father, everything. Promise me you'll set the record straight." Isobel nodded, tears streaming down her cheeks. "I promise." They returned to the cottage just before dawn, exhausted but resolute. Elena gave Isobel what little money she could spare and sent her off with instructions to board the morning train to the city. Watching her disappear into the misty horizon, Elena felt a pang of fear, but also a glimmer of hope. For the first time, there was a chance to end this nightmare. But as the sun rose over Clearwater, casting its pale light over the town, Elena knew the hardest part was yet to come. The sun was high over Clearwater, its rays glinting off the waves that lapped against the shore as Elena walked into town the next day. She moved with purpose, her chin lifted despite the weight pressing on her heart. Isobel was gone, on a train to an uncertain future. But Elena could only pray the girl would keep her promise. The town square buzzed with activity, but as soon as Elena appeared, conversations hushed, and curious eyes followed her every step. She ignored them, focusing instead on the imposing figure of Mr. Hargrove near the courthouse steps. His polished boots gleamed in the sunlight, and his sharp suit was a stark contrast to the simple dress Elena wore. "Elena!" he called out, his voice cutting through the chatter like a whip. "Have you come to confess?" Elena's stomach churned, but she met his gaze without flinching. "I've come to talk," she said evenly. "About Isobel." The crowd murmured, the name sparking a ripple of intrigue. Mr. Hargrove's jaw tightened, his eyes narrowing. "Whatever lies you intend to spread, I suggest you think carefully," he warned, his voice low. "Lies?" Elena repeated, her tone calm but firm. "I think the town deserves to know the truth about why your daughter wanted to leave Clearwater." Gasps rippled through the onlookers. Mr. Hargrove took a step forward, his hand clenching at his side. "This is slander," he hissed, "and I will not stand for it." "You don't have to stand for anything," Elena replied, "but you should know that Isobel is safe now. She's far from here, beyond your reach. And when she's ready, she'll tell everyone exactly why she had to run." The color drained from Mr. Hargrove's face. though he quickly masked his fear with anger. "You have no proof," he said, his voice trembling with barely restrained fury. "Maybe not," Elena conceded, "but you have a reputation to protect, don't you? If word gets out that your daughter fled from you, what will that do to your precious legacy?" The crowd murmured again, their whispers growing louder. Mr. Hargrove's eyes darted to the faces around him, the weight of their judgment pressing down like a vice. "This isn't over," he growled, before turning on his heel and storming away. Elena's confrontation with Mr. Hargrove had sent shockwaves through Clearwater. By evening, the whispers had grown into full-blown speculation, and the once loyal townsfolk began to question the man they had revered for so long. But Elena knew her victory was fragile. If Isobel faltered or failed to follow through on her promise, the tide could turn against her in an instant. That night, Elena sat by the fire with Leo, his head resting in her lap as she ran her fingers through his hair. The warmth of the flames was a small comfort against the uncertainty that loomed over them. "Mama," Leo said softly, breaking the silence. "Why does Mr. Hargrove hate us?" Elena's hand stilled, her heart aching at the question. "He doesn't hate us, mijo," she said, though the words felt hollow. He doesn't understand us." Leo frowned, his small brow furrowing. "But you're the nicest person I know. How can he not see that?" Elena smiled faintly, brushing a curl from his forehead. "Sometimes people don't want to see the truth. It scares them." "Are you scared?" Leo asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Elena hesitated, then leaned down to press a kiss to his forehead. "I'm only scared of losing you," she admitted. "But as long as we have each other, we'll be okay. Do you believe that?" Leo nodded, his eyes shining with a trust that made Elena's heart swell. "I believe you, Mama." The next day brought an unexpected visitor. Mrs. Hargrove stood on Elena's doorstep, her usually flawless appearance marred by the faint shadows under her eyes and the tension in her jaw. "Elena?" she said stiffly, her gaze flickering to the modest furnishings behind her. "May I come in?" Elena stepped aside, her surprise quickly masked by caution. Mrs. Hargrove moved through the small space like a queen visiting a foreign land, her every step measured and deliberate. "I heard about your scene in the square," Mrs. Hargrove began, her tone clipped. "You've caused quite a stir." "That wasn't my intention," Elena said evenly, though she knew it wasn't true. "I just want what's best for Isobel." Mrs. Hargrove's lips tightened. "And you think you know what's best for her? A housekeeper who can barely keep a roof over her own head?" Elena's cheeks flushed, but she refused to rise to the bait. "I know what it's like to feel trapped," she said simply. "And I know what it's like to fight for someone you love." For a moment, Mrs. Hargrove's mask slipped, and a flicker of vulnerability crossed her face. "She's my daughter," she said, her voice softer now. "I only want her to be safe." "Then let her go," Elena said gently. "Let her live her life without fear." Mrs. Hargrove looked away, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "Do you really think she'll be better off without us?" "I think she'll be better off without being forced into something she doesn't want," Elena said. "But that's not my decision to make. It's hers." Silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken truth. Finally, Mrs. Hargrove stood, smoothing her skirt. "I'll speak to my husband," she said, though her tone was uncertain. "Perhaps there's another way." Elena nodded, though she doubted Mr. Hargrove would ever willingly relinquish control. Still, the fact that Mrs. Hargrove had come at all was a small victory. That night, as the town quieted and the stars emerged one by one, Elena stood by the window, gazing out at the distant silhouette of Windmere Manor. She thought of Isobel, of Leo, of the life she had fought so hard to protect. The road ahead was still fraught with danger, but for the first time, Elena felt a glimmer of hope, because sometimes the smallest acts of defiance, like a mother's quiet determination or a daughter's whispered plea, could spark a fire strong enough to burn down even the tallest towers. The days following Mrs. Hargrove's visit passed with a tense quiet. Clearwater seemed caught in a strange limbo, as though the entire town was holding its breath. Gossip ebbed and flowed like the tides, and while some turned their judgmental eyes toward Mr. Hargrove, others remained suspicious of Elena. At the cottage, life settled into a wary rhythm. Leo returned to school, though his classmates whispered behind his back. Elena busied herself with small repairs around the house, her hands trembling less when she worked. It was a fragile piece, one that felt as though it could shatter with the slightest misstep. Then, late one evening, there came a knock at the door. Elena froze, the hair on the back of her neck prickling. She had long since put Leo to bed, and visitors at this hour were rarely friendly. Steeling herself, she crossed the room and opened the door. Mr. Hargrove stood on the threshold, his face pale but his expression hard as iron. Behind him loomed Peter, his ever-loyal steward, holding a lantern that cast flickering shadows across their faces. "We need to talk," Mr. Hargrove said, his voice tight. Elena glanced over her shoulder, checking to ensure Leo hadn't woken, before stepping outside and pulling the door closed behind her. "It's late," she said, her tone carefully neutral. "What do you want?" "You know what I want," Mr. Hargrove replied, his voice low and dangerous. "Where is my daughter?" "She's safe," Elena said simply. "That's all you need to know." "That's not enough," he snapped, his eyes narrowing. "Do you have any idea what you've done? You've undermined my authority, embarrassed my family, and I've protected her," Elena interrupted, her voice rising despite herself. "From you." Mr. Hargrove's face darkened. "You overstep, Elena. Whatever fantasies you've conjured about me, about my intentions for Isobel, you're wrong. I've only ever wanted what's best for her. And you think forcing her into an arranged marriage is what's best?" Elena shot back, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. For a moment, Mr. Hargrove said nothing. His jaw tightened, and his gaze flickered toward Peter, who shifted uncomfortably. "You've always been bold," he said finally, his tone quieter but no less menacing. "But boldness can be dangerous when it's misplaced." Elena stood her ground, her heart hammering in her chest. "Is that a threat?" "It's a warning," Mr. Hargrove replied. "Return the necklace and tell me where Isobel is, or I'll make sure you regret ever crossing me." Elena met his gaze, the weight of his threat pressing down on her. But she thought of Leo, of Isobel, of the countless nights she had spent worrying about their futures. She had faced fear before, and she would face it again. "I'm not afraid of you," she said, her voice steady. Mr. Hargrove's lips pressed into a thin line. Without another word, he turned and strode back into the night, Peter following close behind. The encounter left Elena shaken, but it also strengthened her resolve. She couldn't rely on Isobel to fix things from afar. She would have to take matters into her own hands. The next morning, Elena sent Leo to Mrs. Moreno's house, insisting he stay there until she returned. She dressed carefully, her simple clothes clean and pressed, and made her way to Windmere Manor. The butler hesitated when he opened the door, clearly surprised to see her. "You're not welcome here," he said gruffly. "Tell Mrs. Hargrove I need to speak with her," Elena said firmly. "It's about Isobel." The butler frowned, but disappeared into the house. Moments later, Mrs. Hargrove appeared in the doorway, her expression a mix of curiosity and irritation. "Elena," she said, "this isn't appropriate." "Neither is what your husband is doing," Elena replied. "But that hasn't stopped him." Mrs. Hargrove's eyes widened slightly, and she glanced over her shoulder before stepping outside and closing the door behind her. "What are you talking about?" "Mr. Hargrove came to my house last night," Elena said. "He threatened me. He wants me to give him the necklace and tell him where Isobel is." Mrs. Hargrove's face paled. "He's desperate," she said, almost to herself. "He's afraid of losing control." "He already has," Elena said. "And you have a choice to make. You can keep standing by him, or you can stand up for your daughter." Mrs. Hargrove's lips parted as if to argue, but no words came. She looked away, her hands clasped tightly. "What do you expect me to do?" she whispered. "Convince him to back down," Elena said. "Help me protect her." Mrs. Hargrove hesitated, her internal struggle plain on her face. Finally, she nodded, her voice barely audible. "I'll try." Elena left the manor feeling both hopeful and apprehensive. Mrs. Hargrove's support was far from guaranteed, but it was a start. Later that evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, a messenger arrived at Elena's door. He handed her a folded note sealed with the Hargrove family crest before disappearing into the shadows. Elena opened the note, her hands trembling. The words were few but chilling. Midnight, the chapel. Come alone. The chapel loomed in the moonlight, its silhouette jagged and foreboding against the inky sky. Elena stood at the edge of the clearing, her breath visible in the cold night air. She had considered ignoring the note, but deep down she knew this confrontation was inevitable. Mr. Hargrove would not stop until he had the necklace and control over his daughter's fate restored. Elena stepped forward, her heart pounding. The wooden door groaned on its hinges as she pushed it open, revealing the dark, cavernous interior. The faint scent of damp wood and old candles filled the space. Shadows danced along the walls as a single lantern flickered in the far corner. Mr. Hargrove stood by the altar, his back to her. When she entered, he turned slowly, his face set in an unreadable mask. "You came," he said, his voice quiet but dangerous. "You didn't leave me much choice," Elena replied, keeping her tone steady. Mr. Hargrove gestured to the pew in front of him. "Sit. I'll stand," she said. A flicker of annoyance crossed his face, but he let it pass. "Let's not waste time, Elena. I know you have the necklace. Bring it to me, and this will all end." Elena's jaw tightened. "It's not that simple." Mr. Hargrove stepped closer, his eyes narrowing. "I don't think you understand your position. You've made yourself an enemy of this family, and I assure you that is not a position anyone survives for long." "I understand perfectly," Elena shot back, "but you're the one who doesn't understand. Isobel is gone. She's safe, and she's not coming back. No necklace, no threats, no amount of power will change that." For the first time, Mr. Hargrove's mask slipped, revealing a flash of fear. "You've poisoned her against me," he said, his voice rising. "You've turned her into something she's not, something weak." "She's not weak," Elena said fiercely. "She's strong enough to know she deserves more than a life dictated by your rules. You think you've won, don't you?" he hissed, stepping closer. "But this isn't over. You'll regret standing in my way." Elena's hands clenched at her sides. She had prepared herself for this moment, but the raw fury in his voice sent a shiver down her spine. "No," she said, her voice firm. "You'll regret it, because if you hurt me, or my son, or try to take this any further, the whole town will know what you've done. Isobel will tell her story, and you won't be able to stop her." Mr. Hargrove stared at her, his chest heaving. For a moment, she thought he might strike her, but then he stepped back, his face contorting with frustration. "You think you're clever," he said, "but you're just a housekeeper. You're nothing." Elena's chin lifted. "I may be nothing to you," she said, "but I'm everything to my son, and I'll fight for him until my last breath." The words hung in the air, heavy with finality. Mr. Hargrove's shoulders sagged slightly, as though the weight of her defiance had finally reached him. Without another word, he turned and stormed out of the chapel, the door slamming shut behind him. Elena sank onto a pew, her legs trembling beneath her. The confrontation had drained her, but she felt a small flicker of triumph. Mr. Hargrove was a powerful man, but even he couldn't fight against the truth forever. The following morning, news spread quickly through Clearwater. Isobel had written a letter. It had arrived at the post office overnight, addressed to the town constable and marked urgent. The letter detailed everything: her father's attempts to control her, the arranged marriage, and Elena's role in protecting her. By midday, the town square was abuzz with whispers. Many were shocked, others sympathetic, but one thing was clear. Mr. Hargrove's iron grip on Clearwater was slipping. Elena stood on the porch of her cottage, watching as townsfolk passed by with curious glances. She knew her reputation might never fully recover, but she also knew she had done the right thing, for Isobel, for Leo, and for herself. That evening, Mrs. Hargrove arrived at the cottage, her face pale and her hands trembling. "Elena," she said, her voice shaking. "The letter, Isobel. She told the truth," Elena said simply. Mrs. Hargrove nodded, tears welling in her eyes. "I don't know what happens next," she admitted, "but I wanted to thank you for everything." Elena met her gaze, her expression softening. "She's your daughter," she said. "Fight for her." Mrs. Hargrove's lips trembled, and for a moment she looked as though she might collapse. But then she straightened, nodding resolutely. "I will." As the sun set over Clearwater, Elena sat by the fire with Leo, the weight on her shoulders finally beginning to lift. The storm that had threatened to destroy them had passed, leaving in its wake a fragile but undeniable sense of hope. For the first time in weeks, Elena allowed herself to breathe deeply, to dream of a future where she and Leo could live without fear. She knew the road ahead would still be difficult, but she also knew they would face it together. And that, she realized, was all that mattered. The days following Isobel's letter were a whirlwind. Mr. Hargrove's carefully cultivated image as a man of power and respect began to crumble. Though he tried to downplay the accusations, the letter's vivid details left little room for doubt. Whispers turned into outright condemnation as townsfolk pieced together years of quiet manipulation and control. For Elena, the change in public opinion was bittersweet. Some offered apologies for their earlier judgment, but others avoided her entirely, unable to reconcile their assumptions with the truth. She accepted it all with quiet grace, focusing instead on rebuilding her life with Leo. One afternoon, as the tide rolled in and seagulls cried overhead, Mrs. Hargrove arrived unannounced at the cottage. Her carriage stood out starkly against the modest homes of the hill, and her presence drew curious glances from neighbors. Elena opened the door, her brow furrowing in surprise. "Mrs. Hargrove." The woman's expression was weary but determined. "May I come in?" she asked. Elena nodded, stepping aside. Mrs. Hargrove glanced around the small, tidy space, her eyes lingering on the simple wooden table where Leo's books and toys were scattered. "I wanted to tell you," Mrs. Hargrove began, her voice trembling slightly. "I've left him." Elena blinked, caught off guard. "You've... what?" "I left Windmere Manor," Mrs. Hargrove clarified. "Isobel's letter. It opened my eyes. I stayed silent for too long, and I allowed him to harm people in ways I can never undo. But I can't stay with him. Not anymore." Elena's chest tightened. She knew this decision couldn't have been easy, and for a moment, she felt a pang of pity for the woman who had spent years trapped in her own gilded cage. "Where will you go?" "I'm staying with my sister in the city," Mrs. Hargrove said. "I've already written to Isobel. She wants me to join her there when she's settled." Elena nodded, her admiration for Mrs. Hargrove growing. It wasn't easy to walk away from power, wealth, and a life of privilege, even when those things were tainted. "I wanted to thank you again," Mrs. Hargrove continued, her voice breaking. "You stood up for my daughter when I couldn't. You showed her what courage looks like." "I did what anyone would have done," Elena said quietly. "No," Mrs. Hargrove said firmly. "You did what I should have done, and for that, I'll always be grateful." After Mrs. Hargrove left, Elena sat by the window, watching as the carriage disappeared down the dirt road. A soft breeze carried the salty scent of the ocean, and for the first time in what felt like years, Elena allowed herself to hope that better days were ahead. The next morning, a letter arrived for Elena. The envelope was plain, the handwriting unfamiliar. Inside, a note read, "Elena, I'm safe. I've found work at a dressmaker's shop, and I'm learning more every day. Mama wrote to me, she's coming soon, and I can't wait to see her. You gave me a chance to live my own life, and I'll never forget what you did for me. With gratitude, Isobel." Elena read the letter twice, her eyes misting over. She folded it carefully and placed it in the drawer where she kept her most precious things. A locket from her mother, a drawing Leo had made when he was 5, and now this letter. That evening, Elena and Leo walked along the shore as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and gold. The waves lapped gently at their feet, and Leo skipped ahead, collecting smooth stones to add to his growing collection. "Mama!" he called, holding up a particularly shiny one. "Look at this one!" Elena smiled, her heart swelling with love. "It's beautiful, mijo," she said, taking the stone and tucking it into her pocket. They sat on a weathered log, watching the waves roll in. Leo leaned against her, his small hand resting in hers. "Are we happy now?" he asked suddenly, his voice quiet but curious. Elena looked down at him, her chest tightening with emotion. "We're getting there," she said. "Happiness isn't always something that happens all at once. Sometimes it comes in little pieces." Leo nodded as though this made perfect sense. "As long as we have each other," he said, "we'll be okay." Elena wrapped her arm around him, pressing a kiss to his forehead. "Exactly," she whispered. That night, as the town settled into its familiar rhythm, Elena sat by the fire, stitching a patch onto one of Leo's shirts. The future was uncertain, but for the first time, it didn't feel so frightening. She had fought for her family, for her dignity, and for the truth, and she had won. And no matter what challenges lay ahead, she knew she could face them, because in her heart, she carried the quiet strength of a mother's love and the unshakable belief that even in the darkest of times, there was always a glimmer of light. The weeks turned into months, and life in Clearwater began to settle into a new rhythm. Without Mr. Hargrove's influence looming over the town, the atmosphere shifted subtly. Whispers about the once powerful family faded, replaced by a cautious respect for Elena, who had quietly endured so much. Though she still kept to herself, her name no longer carried the same bitter sting it once had. One crisp autumn morning, Elena was tending to the small vegetable garden behind her cottage when she heard the sound of approaching footsteps. She straightened, wiping her hands on her apron as Leo bounded into view, his face lit with excitement. "Mama, there's a carriage at the square," he said, his words tumbling over each other. "It's Mrs. Hargrove and Isobel." Elena's heart leapt. She hadn't expected to see either of them again so soon. Setting down her tools, she quickly cleaned herself up and followed Leo into town. The sight that greeted her made her pause. Isobel stood beside the carriage, her posture straighter and her expression brighter than Elena had ever seen. She wore a simple but elegant dress, and her hands were clasped tightly around her mother's. Mrs. Hargrove looked transformed as well, her once perfected features now softened by a quiet humility. When Isobel saw Elena, her face lit up, and she rushed forward, wrapping her arms around her. "Elena," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I had to come back. I had to see you." Elena hugged her tightly, tears springing to her eyes. "You look so well," she said, "so strong." "I feel it," Isobel replied, pulling back to smile at her. "Thanks to you." Mrs. Hargrove stepped forward, her hands clasped nervously. "Elena," she began, her voice trembling, "I can never repay you for what you've done. For my daughter and for me, you don't owe me anything," Elena said gently. "I only did what was right." Mrs. Hargrove shook her head. "You gave us a chance to break free, and now I want to do the same for you." She turned to gesture toward the carriage, where Peter, the former steward of Windmere Manor, stood with a bundle of papers in his hand. "What is this?" Elena asked, frowning in confusion. "It's the deed to this land," Mrs. Hargrove said, her voice steady. "I've signed it over to you. The cottage, the garden, all of it. It's yours." Elena stared at her, the weight of the words sinking in. I can't accept this." "You can," Mrs. Hargrove insisted. "And you must. This isn't charity, Elena. It's a thank you, a way for me to begin making amends." For a long moment, Elena said nothing, her hands trembling as she took the papers. She looked down at them, then back at Mrs. Hargrove and Isobel. "I don't know what to say." "Say yes," Isobel said with a smile. "You've earned it." Elena's throat tightened, and she nodded, unable to speak. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Elena sat on the porch of her newly owned home, watching Leo chase fireflies in the yard. She felt a profound sense of peace, a rare and precious gift after everything they had endured. Isobel and Mrs. Hargrove had left for the city, promising to return for visits, but their kindness lingered like a warm light in Elena's heart. For the first time, she felt the weight of the past lifting, replaced by a quiet hope for the future. Later, as she tucked Leo into bed, he looked up at her with sleepy eyes. "Mama," he murmured, his voice soft. "Are we happy now?" Elena leaned down, brushing a curl from his forehead. "Yes, mijo," she said, her voice filled with emotion. "We're happy." He smiled, his eyes drifting closed, and Elena sat beside him for a long time, listening to his steady breathing. The world outside their little home was still full of challenges, but inside these walls there was love, there was hope, and there was a future waiting to be built. As the fire crackled in the hearth and the stars shone brightly above, Elena allowed herself to believe in the strength of what she had built, with her own hands, her own heart. She had protected her son. She had stood for what was right. And in doing so, she had claimed something no one could ever take away, a life filled with dignity, love, and the quiet triumph of never giving up. If this story moved you, subscribe to HeroKind Stories for more heartfelt tales of love, resilience, and hope. Share this story with someone who believes in the power of truth and the strength of the human spirit. Leave a comment below. What moment touched your heart the most? We'd love to hear from you.